to call the Yreka Planning Commission, June 15th, 2022 to order. And let's rise for the flag salute.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, roll call.
You want to call it?
Present. Present.
And Commissioner Fernandez is absent. And when she comes back in, we'll just take roll again real quick.
All right, no special presentations, general public comments. There's nobody here, so I will open that. Staff or commissioner comment.
Just to update, City Council is starting some strategic planning sessions. They're gonna have their first one tomorrow, which is just going to be going over all of the projects that we have going on right now. They'll be doing a couple of different sessions around kind of prioritizing those projects, because right now we've got quite a few. That's not including our private development applications that we're processing at the moment. So if planning commissioners would like to be involved in that process, please let me know. We can get you the dates for those. No, it's going to be just some special meetings for them to go over and ask questions on like the current projects. For example, there's the homeless encampment project that they're working on. Some of our water projects that we're working on. And so if you want any updates on that, we can get you guys the recordings, or the first one is kind of happened really quick, but it'll be tomorrow, I think, starting at 6 or 6. Yeah, at 6 o'clock here. If you're interested, and there is a Zoom link for it, so people can zoom in if you want. And then, like I said, it'll be recorded. So if you want updates on any particular projects that we have. Yeah, and what I can do is I'll make a note for myself. I'll send you guys the project list at least, and you can take a look at what we've got going on. And that's not even comprehensive to what we have docketed as well. So we'll just keep you guys informed on that. There's a lot going on. And then your disc golf proposal is going to City Council hopefully next week. So we've worked with them, and that should be good to go. Good. Oh, we do have one. Yep. Any, so just general information, any changes to the municipal code in Title 16, which is our zoning code, does need to be required to be publicly noticed and publicly heard at both the Planning Commission and the City Council level, where other ordinances, say for like business licenses, which is not within the zoning code, do not need to be publicly heard. So thank you. This is part of a Senate Bill 2 grant that the city received in 2020, which was to help streamline housing production within the city. And one of the approved tasks from City Council was the creation of an objective design standards ordinance. And so this is put in place to meet Senate Bill 35, which went into effect January 1st, 2018. which basically is trying to get cities to streamline the housing development process for specifically low-income housing as well as high-density housing. So right now, the Senate bill does have some streamlining requirements for cities. So right now, if someone did want to come in and use that SB 35 streamlining clause, they could. What this does is this sets up base objective design standards that they would have to follow for us. So without these in place, they would basically be able to propose whatever they would want for design standards. So this kind of ensures that any future development for multi-housing specifically is done in a way that's cohesive to the existing design of the city. Now, we don't have a design code for the city. It has been a little bit loosey-goosey, to say the least, in terms of whether we prefer brick or wood architecture, certain coloration, things like that. We don't have a standard. So what I did working with the consultant eCore is I tried to look at our historic district and take some of the elements of that and put it into the standards so that any new development is going to be a little bit more cohesive with our historic look. So we avoid situations like the new courthouse, which has a very modern look to it and doesn't necessarily fit into kind of more of that historic minor design format. The other thing this does is this is an objective design standard as opposed to subjective design standards. So for housing now, we have to be able to give them a yes or no design standard. And so you'll see in the proposed ordinance, which actually the language itself starts on page 11 of your packets. It basically is a yes or no. So if they're going to be proposing parking areas, it has to have certain elements. And if they have the element, they get a yes, they move forward. If they don't have it, they're basically required to put that in. So what subjective does is subjective would be kind of like a touchy-feely qualitative value statement that Planning Commission could impose. We want to move away from those types of regulations just because it's not consistently applied between developments. So for example, my favorite is Mount Shasta has a mountain village theme. Mountain village theme means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and that's what makes it subjective. And so we want to avoid those things. So what this does is it looks very prescriptive and detailed, but it's very similar to a lot of what's already required within the building code. It just ensures that to meet the streamlining process that they're going through and doing these different areas. One of the things that is unique to this as opposed to other code standards is that it does require outdoor recreation spaces for larger scale development, larger scale developments. It's a little bit more prescriptive on its landscaping requirements in terms of preferring native drought tolerant plants that are pollinator friendly. These are just based off of oh, and we have another one in here, planting shall not include fire hazardous plants, which is just something we've internally looked at as staff as being probably a direction we should be taking all of our future developments to ensure that as they continue to move forward, that we're doing something that's fire friendly or fire hardened. Don't want to encourage any additional plants that could be more fire prone than others. For example, Scotch broom puts off an oil that makes it much more flammable. And so we want to avoid using those types of plants. And again, the outdoor recreation piece, ensuring that kids, multifamily projects or senior housing developments have outdoor spaces for them. It's a public health issue to have those pieces in there. So I'm just going to open it up. We're also recommending that it is a notice of exemption because creating these standards doesn't create any direct or indirect impacts on the environment because every single development that would use these standards would be a project in and of itself and be analyzed through CEQA separately when they come through. And in most cases, they would be categorically exempt based off of these ordinance regulations. So I will open it up because there's a lot in here and it'll probably be easier to scoop through questions. It shortened it from 400 to 300. It's a recommendation from the fire area, not the fire code per se, but more of the fire prone areas, they're arguing for shorter cul-de-sacs just because of fire safety issues. One of the things they are asking though, that you'll see was added in here is they shall be connected to other streets by a pedestrian and cycling path that could also be utilized as a fire escape route in terms of emergencies. So those are recommendations by the state CAL FIRE regulations and then the state fire Fire Safe Council are recommending those changes.
Juliana, did you consult with any builders regarding these regulations and the viability of a project like this? I mean, did you model something here where you said, okay, we could buy this lot, we'll build 30 units, we will follow this to a T to figure out what that's going to cost?
So I did not ask Ecor if they did. They put this together prior to
Oh,
my
yeah,
arrival.
Yeah,
So
I see he's from a consulting firm out of Chico. When I read this, to me, this is Orange County. This is Palm Springs. This is a higher design standard than most of our houses in the city of Yreka. I mean, we're talking about 3 different fenestrations on a 3-level building with offsets and offset balconies. It sounds like you're trying to create low-income housing in a project that is not suited for this community. It is such a high design standard. Yeah, it doesn't fit with what we have. It calls out specific fencing, and none of it's cheap. It's bike lanes, 14-foot wide pedestrian pathways.
Mhm.
If you tried to cost this out in an actual project, you will see that no builder will ever do this in the city of Yreka. It is just too expensive and they won't make their money back. So I'm opposed to, I'm okay with a minimum design standard so a builder can come in and quickly go, here it is, we met all the criteria, we can now build this low income housing that the community will accept. But I don't think we're out to design something that is, I mean, that would be nicer than anything in this.
Mhm.
We're building it right now. Yeah. No, nobody would build it. And if you actually sat down with a builder and had a sample project and price that out, it would be in the millions.
Mhm.
It'd be in the millions. We don't have projects here like that. Yeah. So here we go. Here we start with our low income stuff with a design standard that's so high. What's the next one that comes out? Now we're going to adopt design standards for all our single families that are going to price everybody out because you can't build that house either. So I'm opposed to everything that was presented.
I don't believe they were, but I would have to ask Ecor. They put this together under the grant and they started this project in 2020. So I don't believe they did.
Right. His resume is he produces these for cities all over the state of California. I don't know that. Did he come to Yreka?
Again, I
So
wouldn't know that. I have to ask.
yeah.
I will
Yeah,
say
what's-
that these regulations do match the newest proposal for the Siskiyou Crossroads. So the 50-unit low income facility actually follows these regulations pretty closely. Mhm. So this would not apply to a fourplex. So I think
It
that's
would-
what we need
it
to
would apply to
clarify with. So it would be for 5 or more units. And again, it's also for those that request the streamlining process as well.
Right. I think if we could come up with some builders' common sense, like what is our nicest low-income units in town right now?
It will be the Siskiyou Crossroads.
Well, I mean, existing today.
I think people would argue you don't have one. So,
I mean, even if we, this just goes so far too far. Right? And I sat and I read every bit of it, and I read the SB 35 and all. I read it all. Like, well, I mean, I see where we need to have it because of our urban cluster. But this is so, I mean, it's beautiful. I'd love to live there, be low income and subsidized housing, but nobody can build it.
4 or 5 4 classes or 6 classes together.
Yeah, just to recoup on a project like that, you're not low income anymore. I mean, it's not gonna be low income housing.
So they don't have to be completely low income.
Well,
They,
even
yeah.
at the 50% standard
It's 25%.
or 25%, but
And then if it's moderate level income, which would include my income demographic, it would only be 10%.
I would say doing the rent surveys that I do here in the city, we have rents ranging from about typical rents, 800 to 1,200 now. So even if you rented a nice unit at $1,200, I don't know in a 20 unit complex if you did, you know, how long it would take. Yeah, in an apartment would be real hard, even in a nice one.
I will say that the proposed regulations are less strict than our current code in some respects, actually. So for example, the parking requirements, parking location and access is less strict than what our current off-street parking requirements are.
Until you start adding the pedestrian walkways and the bike paths and the bike parking.
And that's only if you need it. I think that's the interesting thing, is not every single factor is going to be required to have some of those pieces. And we do actually already require, so the 14-foot sidewalks would be on the property. It would not be the curb gutter sidewalk on the city right away. We would follow still the City of Reading standard. And then the other pieces to it are that, you know, a lot of those people are putting those size pathways in anyway. So again, it's just from the city right of way through if you have a larger scale complex. So some of them are still going to be cheaper. Yeah, we can maybe take a look at some of the other pieces in terms of the fencing. For example, the refuse containers is the same as our current code. We already require that. And then the maximum building height is the same as the current one and actually would be higher in certain circumstances. And then screening is already required. So a lot of this is, and what I could do is I can break down the ordinance itself and show you which ones actually we currently already require. And then which ones are actually less restrictive.
It's like, okay, if this is going to be the minimum streamline. The idea is to give builders to build this, right, and provide housing. If we gave them a reasonable minimum,
This would just be on-site improvements for the development itself. And again, the regulations would only would be required for site-specific housing developments. It wouldn't be for subdivision specific. So for example, you would still be required to do the City of Reading standard for a subdivision. But if you were going to be doing these larger scale developments on one lot or a couple of lots that you would combine, then this would kick in. And it wouldn't necessarily apply to any other market rate housing that's related to the subdivision itself. That's just the state definition of a multi-family housing unit.
So we don't actually know which standards increased, which lower.
I can break that out for you if you'd like.
well, is this kind of standalone? Like if I come in and I want whatever exemption, this is going to be the path I take?
Yep.
If you're a developer and you come in and you want to develop units and you don't want to take this path, you can still go the other way.
Yep. This is only for the streamlining process, but we do have
What is
a,
the benefit of this remote?
it's shorter.
It's supposed to make it easy. It's supposed to make it easier. It should cost less, but
It's a shorter review process time, and it actually, per the SB 35, they actually go in front of other projects. And so we are required by law to process those before others. But I can return, we do actually have a couple of significantly large housing developers that are interested right now for a proposal. And we can send this to them to get them input, if you'd like.
I would actually like to see a sample. Like here's how it benefited versus this route versus that route, which one costs more? What was actually more streamlined? Because, I mean, 100% landscape properties with fancy fencing and brick and different, sidings. It'd be beautiful. I don't think it's gonna happen.
Yeah, we can share that with a couple of different ones that would be kind of the demographic that would use this type of standard. So again, we're not really targeting single family housing development, duplex, triplex, quads.
Right.
But we can
Five or
send that
more.
over.
I mean, a reasonable,
I can see how it's working.
A lot of those grants require this anyway. Again, you have to show that you have outdoor recreation facilities for those. You have to show the pedestrian thing anyway with ADA compliance, and 14 feet is the new ADA that they're pushing right now for changes.
you're talking about just pathways through the complex? Or-
ADA, so the regulations may change in the next couple of years. They're discussing having a majority of urban-based sidewalks be 14 feet minimum. It's so that two people in a wheelchair can pass each other. Yeah, again, urban, it would probably be mainly some of these streets that are closer to the downtown area. So as you get farther out into like the neighborhoods, it wouldn't necessarily be required to be as wide. And again, this is just the direction that we're seeing the regulations go. Accessibility is a big issue that they're kind of starting to put into the California Building Code, amending ADA to be more accessible. But again, we can
Yeah,
take
I don't think we
this.
should be ahead of the curve on that. I think we should, I think we should keep our eyes on what is coming,
Mhm.
but not necessarily start implementing those things that are not law yet. We got to keep the cost down. Trying to build here in this city, trying to build in the city is too damn expensive and it takes too long. And if we're going to add a bunch of new costs or code and things, there's a lot in here. I know, I hear it all the time.
So just to kind of
I wanna-
capture the conversation, so your main concern is the high cost of construction.
Yeah, this has design objectives and standards that are beyond the design quality and standards of the community.
So I
As-
guess, so
as-
just for my edification, which one specifically? I know you mentioned fencing.
I told you, I read through everything in here and
All of it.
I would have to throw it all out. I would have to start over.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, but you can't use chain link fence. You gotta use some fancy fence and it's gotta be, but we can't use vinyl. It can be wood, it can be metal, it can be welded.
And I think that's a difference within the languages itself. So again, we use preferred or things like that to guide in that direction, but it's not necessarily a requirement. It's when you get the shalls or, that type of language that would be there. But we do have
I
the
think there was a
prohibited.
shall on not using chain link. in
It
there.
is, it is prohibited. So we have barbed wire, electric, and chain link fencing is prohibited. If you want to bring chain link fence
No,
back and,
No, I'm just saying, I mean, we're going from materials that are affordable to materials that are expensive.
Mhm.
And there's nothing wrong with a black chain link fence.
so yeah, and that's why we bring this here. And that's why I'm
That's
asking.
why I'm just-
Asking the questions is we
Yeah.
can take that out. If you want to keep chain link in, we can take that out of this. And so that's what this process is this does not have to be a final product. And we bring this to you to get this input. So that's why I'm asking the specific questions is if you want to keep chain link as an
I
option.
think if a couple builders would agree to consult and go through, and these are the guys that are doing it every day. They know where their costs are. Yeah. And then bring it, kick it back. I mean, I'm sure this code here can probably be found word for word in other cities around the state. Where, I mean, these are cities that have populations and good tax base. And I don't think it's for us.
And again, it's easier for me to craft something when you're specific. So that's why, again, I ask
I
these
get it.
questions.
Yeah, I
So
get it. I was gonna sit there and start highlighting, crossing out, and just,
We're not building.
Oh, I just a little sidewalk around the corner down there, just cost me almost $50,000.
Mhm.
A street light pole, $3,900. You start adding,
So one of the questions is, do you want us to go through item by item and say we approve that? we don't approve that?
No, we don't have to necessarily go in that specific order, but like, for example, if you have certain things like the comment about the chain link fence, is if you're in favor of keeping that as an option for them, we can just remove that language. We'll bring it back to you with adjustments.
Well, I don't like chain link fences, but that's the first thing. You know, I still think if you have local builders, could give some idea of costs. Now, I feel comfortable with that.
We can go ask a couple. And again, I think, yeah, I have a feeling we'll probably get a lot of people go, I just don't want to do this, but that's fine. That is public input we can get, which is fine. Is there anything else specifically you would like? Okay. So we can bring that back to you guys. We'll go ask. And yeah.
So we can just do that.
Yeah, we can bring it back to you. And again, if you have additional ones, you can let me know before or after. If you
I
want to
get- if I-
highlight or do
Yeah, if I
stuff,
get a few minutes, I'll go take this copy and go through. And
we probably won't bring this back in July. It'll probably come back in August, so we have some time. Mhm. Do you want to pull up the PowerPoint? Yep. It'll be quick. So you're not sharing the screen, just FYI. So if you drag this over to the other computer you have in front of you, then you can do the presentation slide.
this is actually-
That should be projecting. Okay. So we'll be quick on this one. We won't. I had planned this for about 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, to just do a quick rundown of the California Environmental Quality Act. This is going to be a very, very, very abridged version of it. If you would like to really delve into CEQA, it's again one of those things where situations are maybe a little bit easier to work through than just like general law over it. Because again, as we get more and more projects, we're going to have that. So for example, the Yreka Travel Center and Hotel Project is preparing an environmental impact report for you all to take a look at. So we'll have a lot of experience working with CEQA in the next couple months on that. So if you want to go forward, so it is a bear of a regulation. It's one of a kind in the United States. It's one of the most kind of ferocious environmental quality act. It is one of the few with actual teeth that require you to do mitigations. Next slide. And basically we'll turn it into something that's really easy to kind of grasp and go over. It's not as scary as a lot of people make it out to be. A lot of people get intimidated by CEQA because of one of the unique features to CEQA is that it is highly litigious. And so CEQA really only changes when there is a court case involved. And so it's basically judicially changed. There are some regulation changes that happen at the legislature that we'll go over, but mainly it's every year we get a book of case law that has happened in the past year that has changed the CEQA rules. So a lot of cities and entities get very turned off by CEQA because it is a lot of lawsuits. So a couple of terms that we'll go over today. So you'll see an NOE, which is a notice of exemption, which we typically do here. An IS is an initial study, which is kind of like the middle level of environmental review that we'll talk about. The result of an initial study is either a negative declaration, also called a neg dec, or a mitigated negative declaration, which is kind of an end product or deliverable of that process. You'll usually see it as ISMND or ISND. They usually combine the two because they kind of go together. And then you have your environmental impact report, which is your 18-month, $130,000 piece of paper that you get to go through and very highly scientifically studied. And then we have the MMRP, which is the Mitigation Monitoring and Reporting Program, which is basically a addition to the ISMND or the EIR, which is like a checklist of all the different mitigations a development has to do, and we sign off on that as lead agency. And then a project is basically anything that's a discretionary action with physical effects. And so discretionary in this case is when you guys make a decision, or when the city council makes a decision. That's a discretionary action because you make a decision based off of that. And then a lead agency is the agency responsible for CEQA. And this is usually based off of where a project exists and who has jurisdiction over that. For example, if it's something within the city of Yreka, we are considered the lead agency. So we are in charge of preparing the CEQA document for that. If we have something that's on Forest Service land, although that's a little bit different because they're federally regulated, they would be considered a lead agency. And then a responsible agency is another agency with discretionary power. And so typically those agencies are the ones that are commenting on your documents to make sure it's abiding by their various regulations. So for example, we are getting an incinerator for the police department. I'm going to have to do a CEQA document on that. It will most likely be a notice of exemption, but that gets reviewed by the California Air Resource Board with CARB. So they would be a responsible agency for commenting on the operation of that incinerator. So the California Environmental Quality Act was enacted in 1970. It was a large amount of environmental reform happening at the time, and you can keep clicking through. It is really just there to disclose information to decision makers like yourself of potential direct or indirect impacts of a project on the environment. It does not deny a project. So one thing people like to use CEQA for is they say you can't do this project because it's going to hurt the environment. That is not what CEQA does. CEQA gives you, the decision makers, information to make the best educated decision that you can based off of potential impacts. It also tries to identify ways to minimize that environmental damage and then prevent damage through the implementation of mitigation measures. So at no point does CEQA require you to deny or approve a project. It is basically just an information packet that we get for you based off of the different regulations under CEQA. So again, CEQA does not apply to impacts of the environment on a project. So for example, if we have the Yreka truck stop that's coming through, we do not analyze the noise of Caltrans on that particular project. We analyze that project's impact on the surrounding environment. This is only, the only exceptions are developing within an existing hazard. So excuse me. So if you're developing something within the floodplain of Yreka Creek and you're going to cause other properties to be flooded because of your property, then yes, that would be analyzed under CEQA because you'd be making an existing hazard worse. Airports do have some specific regulations around that. Thankfully, we do not have to deal with that here in Yreka. We don't have to deal with airport regulations at all, which let's keep it that way. I don't want to deal with the FAA. School facilities are one of the few exceptions that we could deal with in the future if we ever get, if Golden Eagle or the northbound charter school wants to locate a facility here. That has some air resource control district information. So we have to make sure that we're not locating a school in an area where we will increase asthma rates or have exposure to hazardous waste. So those are the only kind of facilities that have some exceptions. And then specific statutory situations, which I don't believe we would really have here. So for example, CEQA does require us to look at agricultural operations and the impacts of those on the workers themselves. Most likely will not have that size of an agricultural operation here. So non-issue examples, again, we talk about the noise from I-5. It exists. It'll impact all of us currently because it's not going to go anywhere. So we don't analyze its impact on a potential site. Geologic hazards such as fault lines, we can't deal with that because it exists. It's a geological thing. It's not going to move. It's not something that we would detract from the development. We would just make sure they're abiding by the earthquake standards. So CEQA oversight, so the Governor's Office of Planning and Research is technically what we call the sponsoring agency. So they maintain the clearinghouse, which has all of the projects that we put forward. So all of our NOEs, all of our ISMNDs must be reported to the state through that clearinghouse, where they basically just hold it as a repository. And they also do recommendations to the legislature for categorical exemptions. They will also resolve lead agency disputes. So for example, the Siskiyou Crossroads project, although the project is within the city of Yreka, the project is being sponsored by the county. And so we have to kind of sometimes balance those and figure out who's going to be the lead agency for that. In that circumstance, the Siskiyou County did the CEQA document because they were going for a grant. And so we agreed to that. We didn't want to take that project on. And so they prepared that document. And as I mentioned before, they operate the clearinghouse. So if you would like to ever read anybody else's environmental documents, they are all on there, and historic documents as well. The Association of Environmental Professionals publish the CEQA guidelines on an annual basis. If you are very interested in reading that lovely 4-inch thick book, you can go ahead and do that. I get a copy every year. And then, like I said before, the unique piece of CEQA is it is mainly set by case law in how the courts interpret different environmental documents. And so I worked on reviewing a brief for a CEQA case in Mount Shasta that I was part of prior to my arrival here. It's very interesting to read those court cases. They are very dry, but it basically ends up changing the regulation every year. So we have to be really updated on that. I do a CEQA update every year, as well as getting those books to make sure I'm up to date on what's happening and how the courts are interpreting projects. So the CEQA review process, so we get an application, we have to ask the question, is it a project? And I apologize, my animations got a little screwed up here. So if it is not a project, there's no further action under CEQA. So as we see in a lot of our staff reports we've had so far, we have what's called the general rule exemption. That basically means it's not a project under CEQA. There's no way that this is going to have any impact on the environment. So for example, going back to those objective design standards, having standards is not a project because it's not really making anyone doing anything. Now, if we were to go in and do a zoning code change, rezonings where there's no development there and someone wants to propose that development, then we would say, yes, it is a project. So then we go through the exemptions. So we'll go over the several different types of exemptions. So if there is an exemption available, we'll publish the notice of exemption. And so that will go to the state clearinghouse. And then we also are required to take that to the county clerk's office for Siskiyou County. There is a review period for those. People can still sue us over doing NOEs, and they can basically tell us that we analyzed it incorrectly and now we have to prepare an environmental document. And if the courts agree with them, then we will be made to do that for that project. Everything halts on that project. So for example, the Arby's project had a notice of exemption related to it. If someone said, no, I believe that it is not exempt to CEQA, and they can take us to court and sue us over that. If the court agrees with them, we would have had to halt construction, redo the process. So a lot of times you will see planners go to a more conservative estimate. So again, for the Yreka travel truck stop, we take a look at the project itself and we go, this is going to increase transportation in that area. So we know for a fact we will probably have to do an initial study. It's already very congested and the truck stacking in that area is already a problem. And so it will most likely exacerbate that problem to needing that environmental impact review. It is a travel center. They will still have pumps for semis, they will still have semi traffic, and then they will also have the hotel traffic as well. And so we've got some concerns over that. So if it is not exempt, again, we prepare that initial study to determine what's going on with that, and we'll delve into each one of these documents in a little bit. And that initial study will tell us if we're going to do a negative declaration, a mitigated neg deck, or an environmental impact report. So there is nothing after an environmental impact report, which we will briefly touch on. But pretty much after that, you have to make a decision on the project if you want to move forward or not, or how you'd like to do that. So notice of exemptions are the easiest ones. These are kind of some examples. So we have ministerial exemptions, which is basically it's a item that doesn't have to come before planning commission or city council. For example, our business licenses that we do, none of those come before you guys. So that has a ministerial exemption. So granting that business license, again, would not have an impact on the environment. Emergency notices of exemption, like cleanup of a natural disaster or installing a fire line when a wildfire is coming. Those are notices of exemption because we would rather save the structures than deal with potential environmental impacts of a dozer line going in. Categorical is what you'll see most often. So there are different classes within that. I believe we have 23 classes of categorical exemptions, which range anywhere from infill exemptions. So if you have a lot like the upper right-hand corner, if you have a lot that's been developed all around it and there's nothing on it, you can get an infill exemption because, the impacts to the surrounding environment are going to be very minimal because everything has been developed up. So the other one is statutory exemptions. So when we have new laws come through, so for example, the accessory dwelling unit laws that went into effect, what the legislature will do is for early adopters, they will have a statutory exemption from CEQA if you adopt ordinances or projects within usually 2 years of that legislation change. So those are going to be more current with, updates that we see. Another one was the cannabis regulations. So the Department of Cannabis Control has statutory exemptions for a certain number of years for jurisdictions to adopt cannabis regulations. And they wouldn't have to do that. So the initial study has a lot of areas of study, so you can click all the way through these. As you can see, we break it down into these subcategories. We are required to comment on every single one of these if there's a potential impact to these areas. And those can get anywhere from in-depth questions of, will this result in a population increase, to will it be infringing upon a cultural resource for one of the tribes. Cultural resources is separated from tribal cultural resources because in the state of California, if something is over the age of 40 years old, it is considered culturally relevant. So my husband's very excited to be culturally relevant. So these would look into your historic districts. This would be different things like a historic building that may have sunk into a wetland, which I've had to deal with. And so we cannot infringe upon the foundation of that historic building that sunk into a wetland. It's very interesting to deal with. Within the initial study, you'll see what are called thresholds of significance, and these are prescribed in state law. So every single section we go through, we have to talk about these various 4 areas of whether this project will have no impact, less than significant, which both of those are great. That means we're going to have a negative declaration. We don't really have to do any mitigations. The next one is when you'll start to get your mitigated negative deck. So nesting birds or any type of specific type of wildlife that could be found there, you would have a mitigation about, if we find this box turtle, we will make sure it gets moved and does not get crushed by a piece of equipment. It can be as simple as that, or it can be a little bit more involved depending on what type of species it is for like biological purposes. And then potentially significant impact is when we need to prepare an environmental impact report. So this is kind of the Mac Daddy of scientific like kind of situations. So for the EIR, it has to be scientifically, you don't have to click through all of these. You're going real fast on me here. So the environmental impact report has to be scientifically robust. And so we typically don't like to push projects into this sector unless it's going to have a very, very significant impact on the environment. So again, like I said, the Yreka Travel Center and Hotel, with those transportation impacts, it's kind of tipping them into needing this. Now, the nice thing is we prepare an initial study ahead of time. We can take certain sections out of the EIR. So for example, the Yreka Travel Center is not going to really have any aesthetic impacts because it's already developed around it. It's not in the middle of any scenic view sheds. We are not a state scenic highway, which is great. Depending on how you look at it. Because if you're a state scenic highway, we have to make sure the views from the highway are not obstructed. And so we know that this development will not do that. So we take that section out of the EIR. It ends up saving them time and money because you don't have to do a very in-depth analysis of that view shed. So when we get certain things like that, we will have different types of EIRs. So there are project EIRs, which you'll see for like the general plan, which are very broad and will cover a series of different options so that we can tier off of it and not have to prepare as many environmental documents for different smaller projects. There's also what we call the focused EIR, which is what you'll see for the Yreka Travel Center and Hotel, where it's only certain sections that we're focusing on. But generally, we don't see comprehensive EIRs done except for like mining operations, water bottling plants, things that would be extractive resource tend to have a full section EIR. So the first step of the EIR is we prepare a notice of preparation. It basically lets all of the agencies and members of the public who may be interested know that we're preparing this document, and we are required to have a public hearing with that notice of preparation. They also call it an NOP. So what we do at the public hearing is we present the project. We go, here are the areas that we know will be potentially significant. So transportation, air quality, things like that for the Yreka truck or the travel center and hotel. And so it gives people an initial opportunity to come to that meeting and go, I'm really concerned about this. I would like to see this addressed. And so that way we're making sure those concerns are addressed in that environmental document. Sometimes when we respond to those, we do have to, we'll say, you know, again, we looked at this, it's not going to be a big deal, so we're not going to go forward with that. But the other thing that's unique to EIRs is they prepare scenarios. So typically you have a no development scenario, which is your scenario 1, and then you have your build out of the project. But if you do have a significant operation, say the water bottling plant, you could have several other scenarios of, well, if we do this type of conveyor belt system and do this much extraction, here's what that would be. And then they do different levels of extraction. And they will analyze each one of those scenarios for the elected officials to consider. You can go through this one now. So then we'll prepare those scenarios and those will go into a draft EIR, which then go into the public again for comment. People can then, you know, say, I don't agree with your analysis, or I'm satisfied with this analysis. The draft EIR also goes to regulatory agencies, which are very much involved with the EIR process. And then from those comments, we will then address every single one of those comments individually, and then we will publish a final EIR for adoption. So that is kind of the main stuff that we're going to cover for CEQA. It's a very quick and dirty thing, but it's, you know, more of a learning curve. It's more of like a learning experience with them, and it's easier to kind of understand the material the more you do it. One of the other things I was going to mention is going back to that thing is even if we prepare an EIR for the Yreka Travel Center and Hotel, and we find that, you know, air quality, we're going to have lower air quality because of the increase in traffic, that doesn't necessarily deny a project. So if you say, you know, the overall benefits of this project outweigh that slight increase or that slight decrease in air quality, you do what's called a statement of overriding considerations. which is an option for any legislative body where you go, we understand what the environmental damage is. We have minimized it to the furthest extent that we can, but we are going to still approve this project. And that is always available to jurisdictions. And we do not see jurisdictions that use these a lot get sued they get sued just as much as everybody else. So whether you do it or not doesn't really increase or decrease your risk of getting sued through CEQA. But it is an option that a lot of cities will take if it's something that you really cannot avoid. So that's pretty much it for this very, very short. Oh, I forgot I was going to cover MMRPs. Again, this is a checklist. It's a list of your mitigations you have to do. And then we as a city have to make sure that you do them. So for example, if you have to do a nesting bird survey at a certain time of year, you have to have your biologist check in with us and we'll sign off on the mitigation. So you can't just, it's kind of similar to your conditions of approval for your conditional use permits. So for the Yreka truck stop, for their revocation hearing that we did, and you added those new conditions, we have a checklist. It's similar to an MMRP where we go, yep, they're meeting these conditions of approval. Once they get all of these signed off, they can actually then occupy the building. So lead agency is responsible for that. So I'm just going to leave it there. I took 22 minutes, so I'm 2 minutes over. It is very quick and dirty for this one, but it's a lot. It's a very expansive law, but it's not scary. It shouldn't be. Yes.
And that's the most.
Yes. Yes. It's relative. So I have done environmental documents in Wisconsin. So they have WEQA, which, or actually WEQA is Washington, WISQA is what they call Wisconsin's. It depends on what that state is focused on. And so like for Wisconsin, I did environmental documents for frac sand mining. And so for them, they put a lot of stress on road infrastructure and water infrastructure and sewer. And so for example, yes, we do really love our cheese production. but for example, Wisconsin, Iowa also has an environmental quality act. I think most states at this point are moving to have one. If they don't already, Idaho has one. So even if it is the most conservative state, they still do typically have some semblance of this. It's just not. The uniqueness of California is that it's so litigious. I think that's the big difference, is that in Wisconsin, it's under the Department of Forestry. And so they have the jurisdiction to go, no, your document is ineffective. Or in California, it's the court system and judicial system that does that, which is very unique. We don't see that for a lot of any planning regulation.
That's why we get sued.
Yes. California is a very litigious state. And so you kind of have to just kind of adapt your approach to different things. So for example, how many times did we get like threatened to be sued today? Yeah. So you just go, all right, thank you. And you go, if you are going, like one guy said, you'll hear from my lawyer. We said, actually, that's what we would prefer, is that please give us a written statement from your representation. We will give it to our city attorney and go from there. So you deal with it. I think when I came to California, I was very worried about getting named in a lawsuit. And once you get named in a lawsuit once, you're like, you're fine. We won that lawsuit, so I'm okay with that. But yeah, so it's just a different way of dealing with things. It's a different set of rules to abide by. And so that's basically, in a sense, what government is in the simplest sense, is just a bunch of rules. And so you work with the rules, and if the rules change, then we change. So. Yeah. Yeah, and actually CEQA is unique in that it's not restrictive to one region. So for example, even within Siskiyou County, Mount Shasta is very litigious under CEQA. Yreka though, there's certain CEQA stuff that we've done in Yreka that I'm like, that's not legal. And no one has called us on it. So we kind of just move on and count our blessings there. And so even within a county, it can be very different for CEQA regulations. And actually a lot of CEQA regulation is set throughout the state, because it could be anything from habitat restoration to, populations, to the vehicle miles traveled piece that you guys approved last time in the general plan updates. It really ranges from a lot of different things. And that's why we usually go with a consultant to prepare our documents, because this alone is its own planning sector. There are so many nuances to it that even I've been doing this for 5 years. And then prior to coming here, I worked for a CEQA specialist for 5 months. And even in that 5-month period, I learned a lot of techniques, but still it's just scratching the surface. We are working with the rezoning. They have agreed to adjust a little bit, so that'll come back to you in July and should be pretty good. I think the only other one we have, I think that's it. I think we might, and then we'll bring back the, we will have the draft housing element ready for you guys probably in July to take a look at. So the process we're going to be taking, because it's changed a little bit, we will bring you a draft, and then that draft is going to go to the state for their review. And if the state is okay with it, it will come back to you, because we will most likely have to make some adjustments from that review process. So after next month, you will get another chance to go through that review. So that will not be the last time you see it. It will actually be available for members of the public and yourself to review for a couple of months while it's at HCD, and then it will come back. It has to be a minimum of 10 days. What we ran into at the last meeting is the post office has just been super slow getting those letters out. So we've just, I think we have a lead time now of like probably about 4 to 5 weeks to get notices. Oh, 300 feet. Yes. Yeah. So that is Government Code Section 65091. If you would like to go farther, you can create your own local regulations that makes us notice farther, which some cities do. That is completely up to you. Okay. Thank you.